Welcome to this keynote session on being a PhD student and an early career researcher. As I indicated in the morning, I'm absolutely delighted to have two amazing scholars here with me, Dr. Georgina Nugent, who's now based at University College Cork, and Dr. James Little, who is based at the University of Cyprus. And really, most of the presentation will be theirs because most of you are sort of more advanced in your PhD studies, so what they have to share by way of their experience will be of more relevance than what I've prepared. But on the other hand, there are some people who are in earlier stages of the PhD, so this is what I'll be talking about at the very beginning. Now, the idea for this session is that please feel free to sort of interject at any point, ask questions, right? Anything that comes up, you'd like to know more on a certain point, just, wave your hands or whatever, just ask questions. We'll be chipping into each other's presentations as well. We have roughly until 4:45 or ish, yeah, depending on how tired you are, really, how many questions you need to ask, and then yes, you'll be very welcome to ask questions individual of any of us after we're done with the presentation, all right? What I'll be talking about is really mostly conferencing, networking, publications, and building up a portfolio. You can see that it's not just me, but also Emily Pine, professor from UCD, who many of you would have met. I did a similar session with her, focused specifically on publications some years back, and she's kindly allowed me to use her material based mostly on her editorship of the Irish University Review, and etc. So the slides are really joint work of mine and Emily's. Okay. Where do we start? With conferences. Attend conferences. Well, you're at one, right? But now the general points here are very simple, particularly when you're starting your PhD project. Obviously, everybody's funding will be limited to a greater extent or to a smaller extent, but well, definitely limited, right? You need to identify the associations and the conferences that are actually of relevance to you. There, on the one hand, they're the big ones, like if you're in Irish studies, it's ISIL or ISIS in North America, Ephesus, the European Federation that has a biannual conference, or Canadian Association for Irish Studies, and similar networks, right? But these are the largest conferences going in Irish studies or Irish literary studies. They are really useful for networking, for meeting people, not just your peers, and share your feelings about your predicament as a student, etc., but also to engage with more senior scholars, right? But then there are, of course, smaller, more focused conferences that will be of more relevance to your specific project, right? Mostly at those large conferences, they might take whatever, 4, 5, 6 days. What you'll see there is, a variety of papers of varied quality. There'll be always 2 or 3 that are, really speak to your area, and others won't necessarily. But the more focused ones will be, shorter term events, couple of days possibly, and everybody will be engaging with the area that you're working in, right? So you need to find a good balance between the two, right? Because once you start, engaging with those smaller conferences, then of course you'll be moving within a very limited kind of group. You'll just be locking yourself in a particular bubble, and that's a great thing professionally for your project, but otherwise not ideal. Okay, so balance of the two is really handy. Then there are the postgraduate conferences like this one. If you don't know about the Ephesus seminar in Leuven, the Prague conference always alternates with the Ephesus seminar. So the Ephesus seminar is going to take place next year at Leuven. Again, it's an event which I think takes place over 5 or 6 days. Slightly different in that there are lectures and seminars, but also a chance to present your own work. But I'd really highly recommend it. You know, it is a different format, but you know, an absolutely wonderful event. Plus, you get to meet more of your peers. Okay. In all of these, do not be shy to approach senior scholars, even if you are shy yourself and you're a complete newcomer. In my, whatever, almost 30 years of experience of going to these conferences, I can vouchsafe that generally people on the Irish circuit are approachable regardless of how senior are. Yes, there's always a few grumpy buggers, but not too many, not like in other circles, right? So if you've read somebody's work and you're absolutely excited and the person is at the conference, just don't hesitate to, you know, talk to them over coffee or something like that. And, you know, and you're building your networks, yeah? Conferences, now, based on what we've seen here today, you don't really need much of this advice yourselves, right? How to give papers at conferences, that they need to be engaging. You mustn't read everything from paper. You just want to engage with your audience, right? You need to distinguish between the written text and what you can deliver as a conference paper, particularly if you're moving in waters that are heavily theoretical. You know, once you use 3 complicated quotes from, say, Jules Deleuze, that's where you've lost your audience, unless they are specialist Deleuzians, right? So you need to be very kind of judicial about how much of the heavy theory you can actually use in a paper that you give at a conference. Use slides and pictures. We all do these days, but judiciously. Don't overdo it. Don't distract people with your slides. Plus, very important, yeah, always have a plan B. Even here today, we realized that there must have been some update on PowerPoint, and half of the PowerPoint presentations that you brought, you know, mess up the fonts. Yeah, that's a typical scenario. Or you realize that, you know, your presentation doesn't work with that computer. You wanted to play an embedded clip or something like that, and it just won't do it. Yeah. So you always have to have a plan B. If the technology fails, you need to be able to deliver your paper without the aids of, you know, showing that particular video or those particular photographs, etc. Okay? So just be ready to improvise. Okay? Never go overtime with your paper, exclamation mark. Yeah? That is crucial. You don't want to build a reputation for arrogance. You'll always be on a panel with more people. There's always an allocated slot for you, and there are chairs who are to stop you when you go over time. But sometimes they don't really do their job, so they let you talk for, you know, an extra 5 or 10 minutes, and you know, other people really get angry, right? So please rehearse. We've all been there, we all still do it at home. If you think that your presentation might be just a bit too long, just rehearse it at home and time it. Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. And in case you know you can get distracted and improvise and whatnot, you have to be ready to cut stuff as you go along. So you need to be aware of which bit can actually go for the presentation to still make sense if you cut that. Okay? Networking. These are really just general remarks, and general remarks coming from someone who is not on social media. So, what am I talking about? Anyways, do engage online with others, do promote your work, but the golden rule is do not overdo it. You don't want to become notorious as the person who tweets 5 times every day from a conference about what they're doing and what they're listening to, right? Whatever platform you actually are using, right? You need to make yourself visible, but again, do it judiciously. If you're working on something interesting, then publicize it. Publicize drafts of your papers, but of course be careful about people not stealing your ideas, so you don't want to, you know, publicize something that you're still working on and you'd like to get published, because it can get stolen, right? So you have to be very careful about, you know, the kind of balance, but essentially you'd like to know others in the wide professional community that you're there, this is what you're doing, this is what you're interested in, and these are your outputs, okay? Publishing. Purpose of publishing. Well, most cynics would say publish or perish. We've known this for decades. No, there is also a sort of more exciting part to this, right? It's not only about getting a job, but you know, if you really care for what you're doing, right, you obviously want other people to see it and engage with the work, right? So its publication should not be seen as an obligation. It should be seen as something that you're passionate about. You've spent all this time researching something, and you want to get it out there for other people to engage with and to talk to you and perhaps work with you on further, you know, spin-offs of that project, right? To start a conversation, engaging in scholarly debate, right? Most important when you publish is try and resist the temptation to publish undercooked work. Now, of course, there are limits. I'm not necessarily saying that you mustn't try and publish a late draft of a thesis chapter, because in most of your programs you will have an obligation that you need to have some publications, you know, before you're actually allowed to take the viva, for instance, right? And you will definitely need to have some kind of publication record after you're done with the PhD to stand a chance on the job market, okay? But on the other hand, if you know that something needs more work, do not try and push it into a journal at all costs, right? Again, try and build a reputation for someone who actually publishes exciting work, rather than something where there are pretty obvious flaws in terms of, I know I need to engage with this particular area or with this particular theory, but I haven't quite had the time to do this. Yeah. Where to publish? First, you need to look around in your immediate scholarly community and think about what the major venues are in that specific subfield of, say, Irish studies that you're working on. What are the major journals that have the reputation for being the best? What are the major publishers? Okay? Golden rule, always aim high. If you submit something to, say, Oxford University Press, a book proposal, and it gets turned down, so it does, right? We've tried, and then you can go lower with this, but don't, you know, that's the right way to go from the top. Be reasonable, of course, if you know that, you know, what you have to offer is something that is not a good fit for this top tier publisher, then don't try. Yeah? But if it fits their brief, yes, by all means, absolutely. Yeah? Obviously your supervisors should give you the principal guidance, particularly at the beginning of your program, as to where to look for publication venues, but if they don't, you have your peers, you will have your wider community in Irish Studies conferences, etc. And you can also look online. You will become aware of successful early career researchers in particular who are just a little bit more advanced than you are. Look at where they've published. Look at where guys like these two have published, right? Because they are the success stories. Sorry, I keep promoting you in this. Yes, I knew I would get that too. Yeah. What kinds of output have the greatest impact? This is related, and but what I want to talk about here a little bit more is what counts within the system where you're moving, as in the country where you're based, right? Or the country indeed where you'd like to be based. And of course things are slightly different, say, in the United States as opposed to, say, Germany or Czech Republic, as opposed to, say, Ireland, right? There are many countries that will put emphasis on journals that are listed in Web of Science, which for humanities and specifically for, say, literary studies is not much good, because there really aren't any, or very few, right? Second, most important, they need to be listed in Scopus, right? Now, these are criteria that, to the best of my knowledge, still at North American universities are, everybody's oblivious to this. Some of the best journals that are published in North America are not listed in any of these databases because that's not the particular game they're playing, right? But in Europe, sadly, in most national research assessment systems, this is really of, top value, right? So if you know that's you are expected to have an article in a particular kind of peer-reviewed periodical that is to be listed in one of those databases, then that is really what you need to do. Okay. Monographs, of course, and this is going back from the world of corporate academic players, etc. Right? Still, thank God, in our disciplines, meaning mostly in literary studies and theatre studies, etc., what is of the most value, mostly valued by scholars themselves, will be books, monographs, as opposed to one-off articles that get published in a Web of Science listed journal, right? So in most of your cases, your first book will be your finished thesis turned into a book, right? That will be like your #1 achievement. This is how you get known to scholars, principally, as early career researchers, right? Essay collections, or referred to also as collected monographs, right? I'll talk about this in a moment, right? I talked a little bit about publishers. There are just a few of the top tier mentioned here. You could append the list. Of course, it keeps on changing slightly. I mean, say, Routledge used to be, very much at the top, and there were some changes in, the ownership structure, and now some of the works that, say, Routledge publishes are still, #1 and absolutely fantastic, and then there are other series which are not as good as all of the publisher used to be. That things like that happen and keep on changing. Anyways, what's useful if you're looking for to place your book or your collected monograph is to look at publishers that have dedicated series, right? Like you're working, say, in contemporary theater, right? You need to look at which of the top tier publishers run theater studies series, and perhaps even some that are sort of closer to what you want to do, right? If your project is on radical feminism on the contemporary stage, obviously you might come across a publisher who has a whole series about this, right? Feminist practices or whatever, women's literature, women's writing, etc., etc. So try and, because if that book appears within that series, then it will get read by more people. There'll be subscribers, there'll be, scholars paying attention to those particular series, right? Essay collections, right? In some systems, they'll be less prestigious, they'll be regarded, if you edit a book, it will not be of the same value as if it's a single authored book. That tends to be mostly the case, but again, they are very important. And they are also something that has really sometimes, in some cases anyway, replaced what used to be called conference proceedings. Nobody really does conference proceedings these days in pretty much all the assessment systems. That you will get very little credit for publishing conference proceedings, right? Because the assumption behind that is anybody who's given a paper will be in it, right? So what you need to do is if you organize a conference or happen to be at a conference where there's an exciting panel in your area, it's a great idea to try and talk to the people who've given those best papers and think about turning this into a book, inviting ideally senior scholars to contribute a chapter to this, to give it higher visibility. So you can have, something, the seed of an excellent book can be an early career researchers panel on an exciting topic, where the early career researchers have asked more established scholars to chip in with their chapters, right? And those are really, really fabulous books, okay? how do you get into journals and collections? You need to make sure that you're visible as a scholar, that people know about you. You need to look actively for calls for papers for thematic journal issues, right? If you find one, discover it too late, it's just past the deadline, and you have something that would just be a perfect fit, and this is Emily's advice as editor, send it in anyway, unless it's a year after the deadline, because editors always run into problems with contributors. Someone might drop out at the last minute, etc., and you just save their skin, right? And you suddenly find yourself as part of this wonderful collection. Okay. Send inquiry emails to editors and ask them if they're interested in your work. Sometimes they will respond, other times not. Don't overdo it, but if you have a piece that you believe in and you're really passionate about, just send it to the journal and say, would you be interested in publishing this particular piece? One way of getting into even the most established journals in the field is everybody's always short of reviewers for books. So the advice that we always give to PhD students, even in their first year, is offer yourself as reviewers and try and write book reviews. One way to get known to the editors of that particular journal. Second, you get a publication out, and the publication out will be in the best possible journal in the area, and you get a free book. Okay? It's a perfect deal, right? Don't do it too much, because that might distract you from your work on the dissertation, but it is a really good way. Yeah? And if your review is well written and all that, they will remember you, not only as a reviewer, but as someone who's actually a competent writer. Okay? When you're looking for venues for your work, there'll be some obvious matches with your work, but then try and be courageous and think about, okay, perhaps there are journals in a related field, which perhaps, okay, you might be writing about contemporary fiction, but it's in an interdisciplinary context. So you don't need to look only for contemporary fiction journals, but try and look at the other disciplines, and perhaps you might get into a really exciting new context in, sociology or philosophy or psychology or something like that. Okay? And again, it sort of opens various ways for you, on the job market, right? Practicalities, yes? When you submit an article, sorry, some of these will sound a bit sort of to you, but trust me, I speak from the perspective of someone who's edited stuff for various journals and books for some years. Stick to things like the house style of the journal. You're going to annoy editors if they have clear information about how to format your bibliographies and references, and you send it in a different format, right? So everything has to be done to the dot, right? Second, if there is a requested word count, like this journal accepts articles that are between 5,000 to 6,000 words, don't send in anything that's 4.5. Don't send in anything that's 8. Yeah. If that's a requirement, you need to meet that requirement, right? Watch for typos and spelling mistakes, particularly if you're dyslexic or whatever. Yes, just, proof things properly after yourself. Proofread everything. And I know how difficult it is. You've spent weeks with that particular piece, and you can't see your own typos. But try and do your best, or ask a friend, ask your partner, or whoever to just read it after you and discover those words, a word missing somewhere. Okay. Make sure that you erase any references to to the text being a conference paper or a thesis chapter. Yeah. Again, have the people do it, right? In this paper, I will do this and that. No, it's no longer a conference paper, it is an article, right? In this chapter, I engage with, no, you're submitting an article. Yeah, so very careful about this because it can be like a sort of red rag to the bull for the editors, okay? Your footnotes need to be complete and up to date. If the journal asks you to do URLs, you need to double check that they still work, particularly if they're older references, okay? Articles should have a clear and focused argument, which is obvious. And what is also obvious is don't try to, so to speak, chase too many hares, right? Which might happen if you're taking a bit of what is a larger project, right? You need to make sure that you focus on this specific issue rather than on something that needs 4 digressions before you get to the end, right? Because then the article is not going to make sense. It will just lose coherence, okay? I know how difficult it is to prune stuff that you are passionate about and you think is really important, but sometimes it has to be done for the piece to be coherent, right? What happens after you've submitted? First, your article will be screened for suitability. Many journals will respond very quickly, others won't, so, you know, give them a week or a couple, or, you know, depending on what you've heard about that specific journal, and then gently drop them by a message if you haven't heard back, yeah? May I ask you, please, would you be interested in what I submitted or not? You know, I have other options, right? Because that's everybody's situation, yeah? If it's accepted as suitable, it will be sent for peer review, which might take, and this is really an average estimate, about 6 months, right? Sometimes the journal will indicate how long it takes them. Other times it won't. And again, if it's been about 6 months and you haven't heard back, gently ask them, right? Most journals are really overwhelmed and understaffed, and most journals are actually run by academics sort of on the side, and often they're not paid for this. So the editorial work can get quite taxing at times, right? So it's not that people are sort of not doing their job, but they just have too much on, right? So just very gently ask them, you know, will you have the reviews for me, etc., etc. Yeah? And then it all comes back and you'll get your feedback. I will not go into detail about feedback, particularly negative feedback, because Georgina and James will talk about this from their own experience. But essentially what you will receive is a basic verdict, whether the article can be accepted as it is, which hardly ever happens, even to the most senior people. So if you're asked to rewrite or revise, that's fine. That's perfectly normal, yeah? This is what happens in whatever, 90% of the cases, yeah? Even to the most senior people, I can assure you about this, not other people, not necessarily deep, right? So revisions are part of the deal, yeah? Sometimes the revisions that will be requested will be quite significant, and sometimes you'll get 2 reports and one of them will request a major revision of this, while the other one will say that's a great part of the argument, right? So then you need to sort of rack your brains on how to respond to this. Usually editors will emphasize what we emphasize generally, and that is that what you get is feedback, and it does not necessarily mean that you have to change every single thing that is being recommended to be changed, or develop the argument in a particular way that is, you know, you just need to think about what makes sense to you, and you need to be able to respond to all the comments, right? Standard practice is that you revise your work, and the bits which sort of the comments that don't make sense to you, or you think are just plainly wrong, or someone's misread something, very politely indicate why you think these are wrong, or why do you think that these are misreadings, yeah? And then you send it back and you'll get the final verdict. Okay? You may get turned down. If you do, okay, think about the feedback that you've got, think about how to improve the piece, and send it to another journal. Yeah? Monographs, practicalities, nearly done. Yeah? If you have a book project to offer, You need to look at publishers' website. Obviously, most of them will have proposal forms to download. So you download them, but don't leave it till the last minute because there might be certain issues for which you need time, right? So if you're at the late stage of your PhD, you're trying to think of who your publisher might be, yeah? Look at their websites, look at their requirements, and try and complete the form. What you will be asked for is an elevator pitch, essentially a blurb describing the project and why it's innovative and why it's worth publishing, right? They will be mostly asking for a chapter by chapter overview. If it's an edited book, you have to get the abstracts from your contributors, okay? Just brief summaries, and particularly if it's an edited book, you need to demonstrate in the description of the project why this makes sense as a book rather than a random collection of articles, right? Very important, there's always some sort of a context and market sections. What publishers will want to know from you is who your competitors are, right? What has been published on the subject, right? And what it is that's new about what you're doing, why your book is actually worth publishing. Plus, you'll be asked to identify your audiences. You know? So you mustn't say things like, this is for specialists in Beckett's late drama, right? Ideal material. That's great, but there's only about, whatever, 50 of them worldwide. Yeah. Sorry.
I'll read your book.
I'm sure he's not put this into his book proposal. But honestly, try and think about wider audiences beyond your immediate bubble, right? And be always truthful. Be inventive but truthful. Don't make up things that are not true. Don't try and sell a heavily theoretical book as something that could be used at secondary school. I mean, that's just plain nonsense, and the publisher's editor will see it right away. Same goes for the competitors. If you know that there's stuff out, you will have to put it on the list, and you will have to say how different or in what respect your project is different. Yeah. Often what happens is that something was published on the subject, but it happened in the 1980s and the book is no longer available. So you list it and you say that book is no longer available. Plus, of course, 50 years later, etc. There's been developments. Yeah. But try and have a comprehensive list of everything that was published on the subject. And last but not least, most publishers will ask you specifically, so why is it you want to publish it with us? So apart from telling them, I think you're great as a publisher, you have to have more specific reason, right? If it's something that you're proposing within a specific series, the response is, very clear, right? But if it isn't, you can even mention things like, I've heard about your editorial practice being rigorous, or the time frames that you offer, and what kind of reputation you have for, reliability, anything that's positive. Okay. A few more comments about career building further. When you publish, don't try and publish only on the immediate subject that you're covering in your thesis. What is absolutely crucial is that if you take a detour, you mustn't do it too often, because you really have to work on your dissertation and try and get that finished. But on the side, every now and then, if your project is, I don't know, on the novels of John Banville, right? Why don't you try and publish something which is not immediately about Banville, but about, say, modernist or postmodernist fiction or historical fiction, etc., which is an area that you're moving in anyway, because you don't want to get known as the person who writes only about John Banville. Yeah? It's as simple as that. Okay, reviews I mentioned already, and then try and gain as much teaching experience as possible. And that will differ depending on where you're based and you know, if you're on a research scholarship, etc. Right? Like at our institution, the situation is that PhD students are essentially discouraged from teaching, so they get very little practice. Even before they were discouraged, we just were, you know, we would not be unethical like universities in other places where once you're in the department as a PhD student, you immediately get to teach composition or something like that, and you don't get paid for this, right? We are short on resources. We essentially have no money to give to PhD students for teaching, so our PhD students don't teach unless it's some part of a grant, or there's a small scheme run by the Faculty of Arts whereby PhD students can teach an optional seminar, mostly around their dissertation, and get paid for it, and it's mostly aimed at visiting students, but it, you know, our sort of home students are allowed in as well, right? So if you're in a situation like this, you'll probably know from the beginning of your studies here that you get to teach once a semester, and that's it, just the one course. So what you need to look for are other opportunities. So try and give talks at summer schools, yeah? Anything that engages with the public, so that you have that experience and so that you have something to put on the CV, right? More about unethical practices and exploiting PhD students from Georgina later, okay? About, you know, what you should do when you're asked to do too much, which is not really part of what you're supposed to do as a PhD student, okay? Very last thing, and I won't go through this in detail, you should have an up-to-date CV at all time, all right? Because you never know. Suddenly, a grant opportunity or a postdoc or something may be advertised, and you need to act quickly. I know it's boring to, you know, keep in mind that after you're finished with something, you need to put it on your CV, but please do that, so that you have the thing ready to send off once it's requested. Plus, of course, there is no template. I get asked this question almost every year from our PhD students. There is no specific template unless you're sent one, but you essentially, this would be like a basic list of what should go on a CV. The importance of these, meaning the order of these, will you know, depend on what you're applying for. Is it a research post? Is it a teaching job? Is it etc., right? So there are certain things that will be absolutely crucial, need to be emphasized and come first, while others can go down on the list depending on what your response is. Okay? Any quick questions? Any quick questions? Yes?
I was just wondering about the research stays aspect. I was just wondering if, like, taking the position as a research assistant would be, like, beneficial towards your career building, or what is that? Like, how valued is doing something like that?
Meaning research stays outside your PhD program?
Yeah.
Okay. It will depend on the conditions of your PhD program, but for instance, for our students, it's a must. It's, you know, it's one of the obligations they have to fulfill as part of their studies already, right? That you're essentially asked to do some research abroad or take an internship abroad, etc. It's always difficult because you need funding, and our students are really badly funded, right? So you always need to juggle, right? And it will depend on the project. I mean, if you're working on something for which you really need to spend a lot of time in archives, right? You probably won't need that much funding, and your research stay will be mostly like completely individual. You just, you know, move to, say, Trinity College Dublin for 2 weeks or 3 weeks and sit in the library every day, that kind of thing. But then there are other projects which won't need that sort of thing, but which will hugely benefit from, you know, collective work at an institution which has a center dedicated to, I don't know, neuroscience and how it's reflected in fiction or something like that, yeah? So that's where you want to go, and you need to work on that. And then, of course, on that particular CV, it's going to be looking great. Yeah, that you've actually worked with the best people, say, in Europe for that subject. Yeah. Generally speaking, I would say people who are hiring will be interested in folks who have experience from elsewhere than just their home university. Anything else? Yeah?
Yes, I said there's a difference between employment history and teaching experience. Because, for example, in France, we're not funded 99% of the time in humanities, so we have to work beside our studies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that is it really relevant if we have, for example, in my laboratory we have waitress, cashiers, etc. So, is it really important that we?
It will really depend on what it is you're asking for, would be my sort of intuitive response. I mean, obviously, if you're asking for whatever, a research postdoc, the fact that you've worked in cafes and bars for 10 years is not going to be of immediate relevance. But on the other hand,
Relevant employment.
Relevant employment history. Yeah, if it's, I mean, if the jobs are in any way related to what you're applying for, I put them down. I mean, you may be whatever, working as a translator, or working in an NGO, which is not immediately related to what your project is, but it is in the wide, broader area of interest. Like, you may be a literature scholar, but you're working for an NGO that deals with human rights. That kind of thing should go on the CV.
Personally, I think it should be mandatory for everybody to work in the service industry.
Sure.
That's just to make them nicer people, but yeah.
Does like teaching in schools count?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, teaching's great. I mean, if you're applying for a post that involves teaching, absolutely. Yeah. Obviously, you don't emphasize it as experience with university students, but the fact that you've actually taught somebody something. Yeah, sure.
I'm not sure it's relevant, but I think just in my experience, I dismissed a lot of my employment history. I thought it wasn't relevant when I was applying for a grant, and I asked somebody who had more experience than me, and they looked at my work experience and pulled out things that they said, you did this, and this is relevant to project management or timekeeping. So maybe to have somebody else look at your CV.
That's generally a great advice. If you have somebody else around you, unless you really need to submit immediately, it's great to ask a friend, ask a peer, would you please look at my CV, does this look right to you? Yeah. They'll find all your typos, yeah, and yes, we'll give you this sort of feedback. I mean, particularly if it's someone who's known you for years, but they will point out, but then, like, at that time, didn't you do this? Why it's not there? Yeah.
And if that person is someone who has, experience interviewing for the kind of position you're going for, the kind of grant you're going for, or reviewing those applications, then even better, because they know from the other side as well then what works and what is appreciated.
Your supervisors would be, naturally the first go-to person, yeah. Depending on what relation you have with your supervisor, but most of them would have been on the other side, yeah. So they should give you comments on this. But then friends are really handy. Those who've known you for a while. Yeah. Okay, I'll hand over to James now first.
Okay, thanks very much, Ondřej, and thanks everyone for sticking around late on a sunny afternoon in a beautiful city. My name's James Little. I work at the University of Cyprus, and this is a really special event for me because it allows me to reunite with people with whom I worked in my first job after my PhD. So I came to Prague and started working in the Czech Republic, and also worked at Charles University, and it's always a great pleasure to be back here, and particularly to see this kind of event, which brings scholars together and helps us understand, you know, what the cutting edge is before it even becomes the cutting edge that everyone else knows about. So it's great to be here, and also to be presenting with my friend Georgina, whom I studied with in Trinity College Dublin. That's where we did our PhDs together at the same time, and Georgina was always the cool person on campus who was, you know, wearing clothes from Central Europe and looking like a much more stylish person than any of the Irish scholars. So someone I've always looked up to and continue to look up to. And I think, you know, Ondřej has very kindly introduced us as kind of these success stories, but a lot of the support that Georgina and Ondřej have provided for me is dealing with those moments in your career where you do not feel like it's a success, which is, you know, very much most of the time. And since Georgina and I both work on Beckett, I think we can claim some expertise in the related area of failure. So I think it's important as well to ask ourselves all the time in these sorts of careers, which take a lot of work and sometimes don't give very much material rewards, to be clear about what success is for us, right? And this will obviously vary from person to person. I'm not going to try to exhaustively discuss this or get all your answers on it, but it's something I'll come back to throughout the presentation as to checking in with ourselves as to what we feel is a reasonable target for us to achieve, and what we feel is fulfilling, what we feel is rewarding in this career, and there certainly is a lot of that. But also maybe to recognise when those limits have been reached, and other avenues need to be explored. And for me, just thinking about this while Ondřej was talking, being part of this panel and being able to be part of this community with the scholars here at the Irish Centre for Irish Studies is definitely something I consider a success, a big success in my career, right? So just being able to keep contact with these people I admire and have a lot of time for. So, when we were preparing this presentation, we went through the really helpful and detailed answers you gave to the survey that Ondřej and the team sent out, and we've kind of tried to divide up the points that you asked us to talk about. But obviously, there may be stuff that we don't cover, or there may be stuff that you've thought of in the meantime, or stuff that comes up. So please ask questions at any point during the presentation. It will be divided into these little kind of bite-sized modules, but just butt in and raise a hand, or, you know, stand up and voice your discontent, whatever format you prefer. I'll be very happy to get your thoughts, and also to get more information on what it is you're needing from this kind of seminar, because it should be a discussion. So these are the things I'll discuss based on the list that you have sent in, and this is where I'll start. I went back to my careers folder, which is still there on this very laptop. When I was doing a postdoc in UCD, one of the really helpful things they had was a seminar called Grad Futures, where they got recently hired staff to kind of bring people together and talk about the job market. And when I was there, I heard from two colleagues at the first Grad Futures seminar, one based in the US, originally one in the UK, both had found work in Ireland, obviously. And what struck me was just how varied their career paths were, and just, you know, from the point of view of numbers. US-based candidate had applied for hundreds of jobs in the year or years before she had arrived in Ireland. The UK-based one had applied for far fewer. So to go back to the question we heard about, you know, research stays and also, you know, CV tailoring, this will vary from place to place, from territory to territory, from job market to job market, and obviously there are differences, across the Atlantic and between other regions. But the key thing, going back to that question of what is success, is to tailor whatever you're putting in to where you want to go, and as Ondřej said, where you might like to be if even if that place isn't where you are at the moment. Okay, so my careers folder looks like this. And it's there's much more failure than success in it, it's fair to say, by the numbers. As you can see, I I divided it up between the job applications for academic, mainly teaching posts, teaching research posts, and down here I put the postdocs because they were mainly based on a project that I had conceived when I was doing the PhD. And also it struck me when I was putting together this presentation that the PhD project I had was something that had grown out of an early master's project. So kind of the two major projects in my career so far have taken quite a lot of time to kind of germinate and boil away in my brain. I was applying for postdocs many times before I got the Marie Curie in UCD, and I was fortunate enough during that time to be in Prague. So just a bit of personal background, my partner, by the time I finished my PhD, had a permanent job in Prague. I knew that this is where I wanted to be geographically. So my tactic was just to write to every university in the country, tell them I'm coming and see what was available. And in doing so, I picked up some, fairly precarious and poorly paid work, teaching on a visiting studies program at the start, and teaching in another university in Brno, Masaryk University, where I was very lucky to get a teaching contract. And then I just happened to be here at the time that the Faculty of Arts in Charles University got a big arts grant, and I was able to get a part-time postdoc from that. I had colleagues in Brno then who encouraged me to apply for an EU postdoc. So a lot of this was thanks to people around me making me aware of opportunities that were available in that place at the time. And I was definitely very fortunate because of that. But when I came here as an Erasmus student in 2008, I already knew and could see that the Centre for Irish Studies was somewhere where there was a lot of activity. So I didn't know that postdoc grant was going to land when I was looking for work. But I did know that this was somewhere where stuff was happening. So I'll talk a little bit more later on about finding those opportunities and that kind of good fortune. But all the time when I was applying for each of these jobs and applying again and again and again, I was always asking myself the question as to whether academia was giving me what I needed. So what was success for me. And I was always comparing, even though I wasn't talking about this at conferences or at events like this, I was always comparing whatever options were on the table to whatever other options might be available outside the field. And I think we would all know people who have gone on to do other things and being very happy outside of academia. And I think it's always worth asking that question and not being afraid to talk about that to our peers, to those close to us. In order to kind of sharpen really what the career in academia can give back to us. This is a slide, a fairly depressing one, from an Irish Universities Association presentation in 2016. So it's nearly 10 years old. But Ondřej, Georgina, will chime with your experience of like the people you've worked with and studied with. In terms of the low number going on to university jobs, what's your impressions?
I think you and I talked about this a few times during our kind of occasional Zoom self-help therapy chats. And one of the things that we used to say was that the longer that we were an early career scholar, the less it felt like it was survival of the fittest or something, and the more it just felt like who was going to be the last person standing.
Right.
It was almost like a zombie apocalypse or something. Like, could you stay in the position long enough to make it to permanent research?
Right. Yeah. One experience I had. So I started applying for jobs very early before I got my PhD, and was supported by senior colleagues around me. But I now realise that they must have been thinking when I was applying for certain positions which required, teaching and publication experience, that I was, being compared to other people who had, as Georgina had said, had been around for much longer and had got the things in terms of publications and experience that I just couldn't have as an early, as someone who hadn't acquired their PhD yet. I'm still glad that I started applying early, because it gave me practice and it allowed me to sharpen what I was doing in terms of job applications. So all of the things Ondřej talked about and the things Georgina will go on to talk about as well. But it was definitely a lesson in how much kind of longevity and hanging in there can benefit you if that's worth it for you and gives you what you want. Okay, and in terms of Georgina's aptly named zombie apocalypse, in all of this work, it's worth considering what our limits are, and what the reasonable pace is. We're having this discussion downstairs that we can go at, and also checking in with those people around you who know not just where your typos are, but you know what your reasonable level of sleep that you require to function as a human being is. I was told not to do a PhD. I was advised against it. When I did the PhD, I was advised not to work so much, and I didn't listen to either advice. And I think you can't be too hard on your earlier self either. But just to put this into context, so in 2020, I finished my second book, and I was diagnosed with a fairly serious chronic illness, which I still have and live with. So a big part of my application process, those statistics you saw earlier on, was being governed not just by what was available or not just what I was researching, but also by what my body could and at times couldn't do. And then also an important factor when you do achieve these research grants and these institutional supports in various forms, and that these things are there to help us as researchers and also as people with bodies that sometimes break down. So by all means, draw on them, draw on peers around you, if you feel you can, and draw on the support that is meant to be given by employers and universities, even if it's not originally immediately obvious. So funding bodies like the European Commission, but also employers like public universities are there to help us. So use them and find allies who will help you get the help you need when it's not immediately available. I can go into details about this with anyone after the presentation, but for now I'll just move on to a quote from a colleague and a friend of ours, who points to some of these pressures on the physical side and also on the mental side that we all experience. And so I don't need to explain this to anyone in the room, but we know that PhD life, post-PhD life, can be extremely stressful. So the question in this part of the presentation is how we manage that and how we manage that together. So we're going to be stressed writing postdoc applications, and there's only so much time in the day, so let's not beat ourselves up about that. But it's worth checking in with others and with ourselves to see how we're doing. Otherwise we can end up like this. Anyone have any questions on this, or any thoughts or strategies in terms of how you deal with the excessive or increased workload for PhDs or post-PhD? I know Georgina's helped a lot with this, and also people in Prague as well. But I'm happy to talk about this afterwards if you want to go into it. So Ondřej was mentioning peer reviews earlier on. Could I ask how many people have been through the peer review process, either in terms of getting something reviewed or reviewing something for someone else? Yeah? Okay, a few hands in the room. So there's already experience in the room that others can draw on as well. I have to say, before going on to the sometimes negative sides of peer reviewing, some of the most detailed criticism and help I've got on my work is from people whose names I'll never know, because when you see the amount of time and detail that people put into their peer reviews, it reminds you of some of the good sides of the profession that we work in, and those people are rare, but they are very much appreciated. So being peer reviewed, especially as an ECR, can be daunting. But a bad peer review, as Ondřej has already alluded to, is certainly not the end of the line. So the main message I'll have in this part of the presentation is that whenever you're part of a peer review process, you have allies in the room or on the editorial board or in your peer circle, so it's important to draw on them and use them however you can. And as I went through my PhD, I started talking, and afterwards in particular, started talking to more and more senior colleagues and realized that, you know, stinky peer reviews, as I call them, are for better or worse part of the process. So I can remember a very senior scholar who's very respected in the field telling me about a peer review that had sunk a book project of theirs, which was their next project, and this really helped me when an important research project of my own was reviewed badly, and I had to react to that and keep the show on the road. So just because bad peer reviews happen doesn't mean it's okay for an academic to review a completely different work to the one you've submitted, but there are ways to deal with this. So number one, again, there are sympathetic and experienced colleagues and comrades outside academia can help to put the review in perspective. Get someone who knows your work to read the review. Is there something you can take away from it, even if the overall quality of the review leaves a lot to be desired? And the other reviewers who have written more positive things about your work, and the editors who have already put time into having your work reviewed and hopefully published, which is all editors want to do after all. Chances are they know it's an unfair review as well, and they believe in your work more than the reviewer does, and who knows, sometimes more than even you do as a writer. So treat all these people, the other editors, the other reviewers, your peers, as people who support your work, and write a response that expects them to do so. And as Ondřej said, you don't have to change everything just because someone has told you that you need to look at a different angle, or you need to use a methodology which might seem relevant to your own work. And then when we come to peer review ourselves, it's important to remember this experience to be rigorous and to be kind. Think of the advice that someone needs if they're starting off in their career with this piece, or if they're a senior scholar indeed who's depending on this work for promotion, for career change, to get out of a lousy employment situation. Reviewing should not be about building or destroying personal relationships. Aside from building the relationships with your editors who are happy to receive your review on time, it's about improving the work as best we can, okay? And the best reviews, the ones I talked about at the start of this section, are certainly the ones that do that and which are really appreciated. Any questions on reviewing and reviewers before I move on to the next section? Cheers. So I'm co-editing a book series at the moment with two colleagues, and it's a really two more senior colleagues, and it's a really educational experience to go through those review processes from the other side. I know Georgina and Ondřej will have things to share on that as well if you want to go into it more generally. Okay, so another question that we got asked was about postdoc applications. I'll talk more generally about postdocs that I applied for, and I also have some slides on a specific case study. I won't focus on them unless someone wants to hear about details about the Marie Curie postdoc, but that's something we can talk about later. Those slides are mainly for people who aren't in the room at the moment and they want to look at it later on. The work involved in postdoc applications can be significant. So pick the ones that are important and useful to you. It may be few, it may be many. Reuse unsuccessful applications if you wish. See it as a chance to develop your research, to get expert advice from your potential mentors or supervisors and your reviewers. The Marie Curie application, individual fellowship that I was talking about earlier on, was about 1 month of full-time work, and I spread this over 6 months, and was really lucky to be supported not just by people within the institution I was going to in Dublin, but there was a research officer in Brno, you might know him, Jakub Zeman, who had nothing to gain from me getting a postdoc somewhere else, but was very happy to workshop my application. And because of those workshops, I think I was able to get the postdoc. So drawing on people around you, finding support wherever it's available, and not just through the official sources is really important. And that's a more general thing that I tried to practice during especially the early part of my career, and hopefully still now as well. Georgina will talk more about this as well. But this, the importance of reaching out, if there's a research project you're interested in, ask if they're looking for people, or if they'd be interested in you joining it. And in terms also of arts and humanities and social sciences, postdoc applications, probably the best piece of advice I got, aside from all the successful applications that people were willing to share with me, even people I didn't know, and that's something that I'm happy to do as well if anyone wants to see particular documents, was to reach out beyond the academic institution, to reach the other cultural institutions. So these are a couple of the institutions I worked with during my postdoc, but what that did to the form and timeline of my postdoc application meant that I was no longer working on my own kind of highly compressed and highly intense timeline, but I had to realize that, people go on summer holidays for the whole of August, or emails are answered much more slowly, particularly during a global pandemic. So it's just worth being aware when we start to make those links with institutions outside the academy, that the timelines that they run to might not be our timelines, and that's why also starting early can be very useful. Okay, I'll skip through the details of my application. I can talk about these in more detail later on. But I'd like to get to the last thing that I'll talk about, and that is job interviews. So the number and the variety of job interviews that I experienced was quite a lot. So I had online interviews, had in person with a lecture presentation. You have interviews with people you know very well. You have interviews with people you've never met before and may never meet again. My advice would be to try to treat them exactly the same. Try to deal with any technical hitches, surprises, in a way that allows you to show that you're a decent person and will be a decent colleague. So my supervisor used to tell a story about someone getting the job. He was told after one interview that basically the person who got the job was the person who could open their bottle of water correctly. I think the modern equivalent is the person who can recover from Zoom breaking down and having to join the interview again, which happened to me in one case. Or in another online interview, I was led into the interview room before the interview started. So it's worth just using these opportunities just to be a decent person and to be the kind of person that others want to work with. But also treat these interviewers as if they are your colleagues, and speak to them accordingly and ask them questions accordingly as to what is going on within the institution and what kind of atmosphere you might expect when you come to work there. One interview process I went through didn't end up in a job, but something I proposed on the interview, my job application letter rather, turned into a research project with someone who was on the interview board, because I had seen in the way that they described the field of Irish studies that there was a gap, and we ended up working on that together, right? So I didn't end up working in that post, but it was an interview which led to other things. And that would be my last slide, because if we go back to that early careers folder, it's clear that there are a lot more interviews, a lot more applications than there are successful outcomes if we judge success purely on the basis of obtaining a job or obtaining a grant. So one thing we can be sure of is that there are going to be lots of these applications and lots of these interviews, so it's important to see them on one step on the road, and not necessarily the final destination. As well as a chance to gain employment, it's also a chance to present our research, and almost certainly to colleagues who appreciate what you do and will remember what you do because they've called you to interview. It's a chance to strengthen relationships, and it's a chance to find potential colleagues and partners, as I've mentioned. Always ask for feedback, no matter what stage the application process ends at, and whether it's turned down as application stage, whether you do an interview, or even if you do an interview and it's successful, get feedback anyway, because it's good to know what you've done well as what you can work on. And always think about as well, try to visit the place, try to go on site, and try to figure out if this is a place that you and whoever might be moving with you would be happy living in. Some people were asking about jobs lists, so I've just put the lists that I use there, as well as a short bibliography. Are there any questions before Georgina takes over and continues the discussion?
I know I'm about to start speaking anyway, but could I contribute before I forget?
Go on. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, in terms of interviews, I have been told if you have been shortlisted to interview, it means that the panel basically considers that you are employable. You're good enough to have this job. I don't like this word good enough, but if you've been shortlisted, you're employable. And the purpose of the interview is often to see what you'd actually be like to work with. So I think that complements what you were saying, James. I think sometimes the questions that are asked in interviews, they might be hard to purely to see how you actually respond to stress or to a question that you don't necessarily like. I was told that one of the reasons that I got the job that I now have when I asked for feedback was because I was so focused on fitting into the department and actually teaching, because not all colleagues are as eager to teach. I wanted to join the department, I wanted to work, I wanted to fit into the culture, I wanted, to be a nice person to work with. And I was also told that I was the only person in the interview that didn't ask what was the earliest point that I could apply for a sabbatical. So, again, because I googled that and knew it anyway. But I do think that you're already really qualified. You're overqualified. You're more qualified than the people that were interviewing you are when they were getting their jobs. So it's actually just about being nice, because nobody wants to work with someone that isn't nice. It ruins, So, but yeah, that was just, yes, I think what you said was really good.
Great, thanks for that, Georgina. As always, really helpful. Okay, so we can set up Georgina's slides.
So it's a real honour and a real privilege to get to speak to you today, and specifically to get to speak on this topic. It's particularly nice to speak with James because, as he said, we've known each other effectively from infancy.
Academic infancy.
Academic infancy. I still don't quite believe it now. And people have spoken to me about this feeling and describing it as something that's akin to PTSD almost. The idea that you can be so qualified and yet your chances of getting a job in the area that you're trained for are so tenuous that when it actually happens, you're not able to believe it. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's something that should be normalized. So in a way, I don't really consider myself a success story. It does feel more like a survival story. I carry quite a lot of anger about my experiences of precarity, and I do hope that I will never really lose that anger. because for me it has become a source of motivation to try and speak out about these experiences and to try and do something positive with it, which is again why I'm really happy to be able to speak here today and try and, you know, turn that anger into something a little bit more proactively positive. So today I'm going to cover the following. I want to give you some context in terms of who I am and what informs my experience to date. I make no claim to be an expert on career building in academia. In many ways I think I was quite bad at it. But both James and myself have worked through this phase. We've dragged ourselves through it. So when I speak about these topics today, I speak directly and I hope pragmatically from my own experience in terms of how you can go from failing to failing better, to once again use an awful Beckett quote. So the case study is a run through from PhD to post-PhD, and then I've collated a number of options that are available to you post-PhD. I'll run you through what I believe to be the pros and cons, and again they're pros and cons from my perspective. I'm not going to talk about presenting at conferences because it's quite clear that none of you guys need these tips, and Ondřej's already covered it. But what I will focus on is dealing with negative or hostile interjections at the end of a panel paper. What to do if someone isn't nice to you during the questions after your paper. I'm going to talk a little bit about negotiating academia as a queer and neurodiverse person. And then I'm going to talk about, because to me that leads directly into networking, and what I've come to think of as holistic networking practices. Finding your people, finding the people who will make all of this easier. Finding the people who value you for who you are, not just for your research outputs. In terms of publishing, I'm specifically going to talk about co-editing. I might skip over some of it because it's been covered, but for me, it has been a key element in career building. It's been one of the most rewarding and impactful facets of my work to date. And it's how I really met and got to know James, which is the best thing that has ever happened to me. And then I'll end by talking about work-life balance. So just to give you some context about my background, I come from a lower middle class family. My parents separated, we didn't really have much money. My mom also got sick during my undergraduate degree, so basically the entirety of my university experience from undergraduate through to graduate ran in parallel with a single parent who was terminally ill. I went to a non-fee paying school. I had a standard community school education. I'm queer, I'm autistic. I was diagnosed with autism in the middle of my PhD. I've only recently begun to speak about this in relation to my work, and only really because I have a permanent job now. My PhD was funded by an Irish Research Council grant. I went to Trinity College Dublin with James. I stayed there from BA through to PhD, in part because of my mother's illness, and in part I now realise because as an autistic person, the idea of moving or change was something that was very stressful for me. I did a 2-author modernist PhD in modernism, 1 Irish author, 1 American author. This ended up being a problem for me in Germany and Austria because I worked in both of these countries because of the departmental divisions between Anglistic and Americanistic. It's something to keep in mind then, just that division, and in an area where it doesn't really make sense, like it's not useful. Going back, I wouldn't have changed that fact, but I do think that students within German-speaking university systems, this division is quite significant and something to keep in mind. During my first PhD, I was also co-opted into a second PhD at another university, which had a digital humanities element. I submitted in 2016, and like James, I did start applying for jobs before I had submitted. I should say that my background is not in Irish studies. It should have been, I think. That would have been a cleverer thing for me to do, but I wasn't pushed in that direction at the start of my PhD. I spent a long time in specialist areas and only tried to start moving into the adjacent field of Irish studies in the last few years. So in total, I completed 38 applications. I did 6 interviews. 2 of them were for permanent or tenure track positions. The rest were temporary posts. I got 3 job offers. In terms of grant applications, which are a little different and often require a lot more work than job applications, I've written 6. 4 were unsuccessful, 2 were successful. Again, as James said, I know these numbers are horrifying, but they give you practice. The type of job application you will write in the first few times is completely different to what you'll do by the end. So even though they're tedious, it's practice. Practice will help you become more secure and assertive and understanding of the type of academic or person that you want to be. So what I want to try and do now is just to give you the narrative behind these statistics very quickly. I think that statistics like this can be a bit inaccessible and maybe also a bit terrifying. So I want to try and walk you through what these numbers actually mean or meant to me and what motivated my decision making, what I was trying to do. Again, it's just to try and show you that this post-PhD pathway is in effect a series of steps that are based on informed and strategic decisions, opportunities that, like, there's informed decisions and then there's opportunities in terms of what becomes available where and when. This is a process. It does build up to these horrifying numbers, but it is a step-by-step process. There are many things that you can't control, but there's also quite a lot that you can control. In the last 3 to 6 months of my PhD, I was applying for jobs on a daily basis. This shows how much the academic jobs market has changed because they're not advertised as frequently now. Unsurprisingly, I wasn't getting many invitations to interview, but I don't regret, as James said, I don't regret applying for so many. Something that I had been told around about this time was that there was a person in the Department of French in Trinity who told me that it took them over 100 applications to get their job. I also know someone who sat 15 interviews before they got theirs. So my reasoning was, and I don't know if I was reasoning ill or not, but I was going to start chipping away at those statistics, and I was going to start racking up the no's and rejections nice and early, because this was one way I tried to frame it. Every time I got a no, it was closer statistically to maybe getting a yes. At the time, I was told by my supervisor that I would need 3 published or accepted for publication articles to compete for permanent positions. This again shows how things have changed even since 2016. It's a lot worse now. In the immediate aftermath of my PhD, I was doing, job work, hourly work. I got a postdoc in the digital humanities. The job application was brought to my attention by one of the members of an interview committee for an interview that I had not been successful for. So again, like James says, this is something to keep in mind. Just because you didn't get a job doesn't mean that you didn't make a good impression, doesn't mean that you didn't do well. It's also something that I've been told is quite important on the continent, continental Europe. By applying for jobs and by interviewing, you're showcasing yourself and your research, not only to the selection committee in the university, but to the person that they bring in as their extern, the person brought in as an external member of the interview panel. What if they go back to their home university and suddenly they need to hire someone, even if it's at short notice or for a teaching fellowship or something like this? They know the people that are actively looking for jobs. DH postdoc, for a while I hated it, but it was well paid, which was great. And what I started to do then was get up in the morning and work on academic papers related to my PhD. The papers that I was working on during this period ended up directing where I am going now with my research. So that's a bit like what you were saying, James. You never really know. I mean, all I knew is that I didn't want to do what I was doing. I wanted to work on something else, and this has now come to dominate my post-PhD research. Okay? I applied for a postdoc in Ireland. I made a silly mistake in terms of trying to argue that I needed to stay in the same university. Again, I am autistic. I didn't want to change university. I found that really hard, and I didn't get the postdoc because one of the reasons that, one of the things they need you to do in a postdoc is move to another university. So that was really disappointing. I felt like a failure and I felt quite despondent. So again, I just threw myself into working on these academic papers. I went down to 0.5 contract in my DH job, and I started applying for jobs and fellowships with an increasing focus on positions abroad. I had reconciled myself at this point to the fact that I would need a postdoc, I need this international experience, even if it was something that I was quite scared of and worried about. I applied for a Humboldt Fellowship in LMU Munich. I was unsuccessful, but again, it introduced me to the postdoc system in Germany, because the professor that I was working with to apply for this position had just started there, and he was advertising and looking for postdocs. He invited me to interview, and that's how I got my job in Munich, which ended up actually being a better job, like a better contract than the Humboldt. Humboldt Fellowship would have been 2 years. This was 3 years, renewable for another 3 years, and extendable for another 4 if necessary. So again, applying for things may not get you what you originally wanted. It can lead to something else, and in certain cases it can lead to something that's better than what you originally envisioned. This was a much longer contract. It gave me years of security. And somehow, you know, I went from somebody that was afraid to leave Trinity College Dublin to someone that was living in Germany. My immediate goals after submitting the PhD and in this first job was to get as much teaching experience as possible. I changed my seminar contents this semester so that my CV would have a more diverse range of convened seminars. My PhD was on Beckett and Gertrude Stein. I started expanding and teaching modern Irish literature, contemporary Irish literature, drama. I branched out. I worked very hard on my pedagogy. Yes, I was precarious. Yes, I was in a short-term contract, but I wanted to learn and understand better the type of teacher that I wanted to be. Every class you teach is an opportunity for you to shape and develop the kind of teacher you want to be. What's important to you, what kind of cultures you want to create in the classroom. So I was trying to find, and I remember at the time one of the professors there said, you know, it's good that you're a really good teacher, but it's not going to be what gets you the job. I didn't agree with him then. I think, and I don't agree with him now, I think when you're in a position where you don't have security, you have opportunities to create little pockets of space where you can be yourself. And this is what I always wanted to be. I wanted to be a good teacher. I wanted my students to feel safe in class. I wanted them to be happy. So this was a way to take control in a situation where, in the overarching scheme of things, my contract was going to end. I also wanted to get as much supervisory experience as possible. I supervised as many BA and MA theses as I could. This is because it's a kind of experience that isn't as easy to come by in Ireland or the UK. It was hard work, it's a lot of work, but I knew it would help me build a CV that would maybe give me the edge over people whose postdoctoral experience consisted solely of research fellowships and with little or no teaching. So again, it was like I felt like it was like a training period. Blah, 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 blah. That's all. I'll move on. So, why am I telling you all of this information? You know I'm going into TMI territory here. But first of all, I want you to see and understand that there's no one way to navigate the post-PhD pathway. My experience is similar to James's, but it's also very different. And I also want you to see that you can exercise control over the shaping of your own academic profile. When I was in Germany, I was put under a lot of pressure to participate in the German Habilitation system and to change, period. I didn't want to do that. Like, there's a reason I'm a modernist. I don't like old stuff, okay? I was put under a lot of pressure to do that, but eventually I said no, and I found a way to stay in the area that I wanted to stay in. So you can exercise control. Understand yourself, understand your academic profile, look at your CV, think about the type of teacher and researcher that you want to be. Look for the places where a negative-minded reader might point and identify a shortcoming and try and fill those gaps. So of course there's publishing. You need to publish your book, that's the most important thing, but also think about teaching, supervision, funding, conference organising. My goal as an early career scholar was to systematically shut down any opportunity for someone to say something negative about my academic profile. I'm not a social butterfly. You know, I hid in here during the lunch break. So I knew that I wouldn't necessarily get my permanent job through being glitteringly, you know, effervescent during conference socials. I worked on other things. I worked on my publishing, I worked at teaching, I worked at supervision, and I worked at creating connections with people that were genuine. My goal was always to try and find a place where I could be happy in my work, happy in my research. So again, this involves self-knowledge, knowing what makes you happy, beyond of course getting a salary for doing the thing that you have been trained to do, which should be your right. I should also say that during my time in Munich, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. I still have this. I will have it for the rest of my life. At times it has drastically altered my quality of life. I am convinced it was triggered by stress. I also think it's not a coincidence that James developed a similar condition to me, and we both have similar enough career paths. So that's my specific pathway. In terms of your options post-PhD, these are some of the options that are available to you. First of all, we have research fellowships where you turn your PhD into a book. My knowledge of this is largely based in Ireland and the UK. So in Ireland you have the Research Ireland postdoctoral fellowships, and then you have the AHRC in the UK, the Leverhulme Trust. The pros of these are you get time to work on your book, you get time to recover from doing a PhD and gather your thoughts and plan ahead and figure out what you want to do, what you don't want to do. Because what you don't want to do is often as if not more important. You also get funding that you can stick in your CV. Every little bit of funding helps. Every little thing adds up. 200 euros, 50 euros, 80 euros, stick it all in your CV. Keep note of every cent that you get. You get experience working in a new department. You can also sometimes get some teaching experience, but not too much. There's a reason for this. Your teaching will be restricted, and it's a sad reason really. It's in place to make sure that the host university doesn't exploit you and get you to teach shows. In terms of cons for the first one, you won't get too much teaching experience, but that's okay. You know, I think the point of one thing that you might glean from my career and James's is that Rome wasn't built in a day. You need to get your book out first and foremost, prioritize that, write the best first monograph that you can. It will stand to you. The next options that are out there are teaching fellowships or stipendiary lectureships. They're increasingly offered in Ireland and the UK. I've also seen them advertised in Germany and Denmark, and I know colleagues who've worked there too. The pros of this, the big pro is you get teaching experience, you may also get supervisory experience. These are great and they're very important from your CV. The other great thing is that you will become an active member of a university department. It is teaching and not one of the many hills I will die on is that it is teaching and not research that is the lifeblood of a department. This is how colleagues in your field will really get to know you post-PhD. And remember too, when you go to conferences and you're talking about your research, you're meeting people that are kind of largely working in an area that's similar to you. But when you're working in a department, when you're teaching, you work as a team, and you're usually providing a kind of broad periodic range of topics. So it's not necessarily the other, I don't know, marina car experts that will help you get a job. It might be that you worked on a short-term contract and the Shakespeare person tells the Shakespeare person in another university where they need a marina car expert. Oh, I know somebody who worked here, she was really good. And that's how you make your connection. You'll probably be the only, let's say, modernist in your department. So that means if another university needs cover, people will talk. It helps you to be identifiable to the people outside of your field as well. Another pro about teaching fellowships is that you might benefit from extensions of contracts or word-of-mouth contracts, or eventually you might, for example, in Cork where I work, one of my colleagues had to take medical leave at short notice, and somebody got a short-term contract to replace her. It's not the lottery, but it is, you know, it's a salary for a few months. But again, this is through word of mouth. One of the cons of this is that you will be overworked and underpaid. Writing new lectures takes a lot of time. It's hard work. If you're new to a teaching position, you'll be writing and planning a lot of new classes and lectures. It will be hard, so you need to take care of yourself. These contracts sometimes necessitate national or international moves at short notice. In Ireland, sometimes I've seen people that might do one in Dublin, then move to Limerick, then move to Cork, then move to Galway. In the UK, you can kind of do something similar. But yeah, over time, this will wear you down, make you feel and look as old as we do. One of the other cons, just pragmatically, is that in the UK, especially many prestige Russell Group universities, let's say Oxford or Cambridge, offer teaching fellowships with salaries that are simply not viable. £13,000 a year or something like this. The idea behind this, or the only thing I can think, is that their name makes up for the fact that the salary is not viable unless you come from generational wealth or have parental or spousal support. The sad fact is that hiring committees are nevertheless impressed by these, especially in Central Europe and non-English speaking countries. To get to spend any time at all in a Russell Group university is seen as a massive bonus. You will often see these stipendiary lectureships in the CVs of established academics in the UK in particular. The next thing that you can do, and the thing that James and I both did, and the one that I really recommend, is to travel and go abroad. Apply for postdocs and teaching positions in a country other than the country that you completed your PhD in. For me, this was invaluable because I work in modernism. My approach to teaching modernism completely changed when I was speaking to students in Germany. So, for those of you that are doing your PhDs in Irish or UK universities, why would you go abroad? The major pro is that German, Austrian, Swiss postdocs are very well paid, like really well paid, compared to what you'd be used to in Ireland. You get a lot more freedom in terms of designing and delivering courses, as well as supervising BA and MA theses. It will really enrich your understanding of your discipline and how you teach your subjects. You get to live in a new country. It's just a nice thing to do. It's really enriching. It's really cool. And the other thing is that these contracts tend to be longer. I had a 2-year contract that became a 3-year. That literally felt like the rest of my in the immediate aftermath of my PhD. Cons: you won't be allowed to lecture in Germany unless you have a habilitation. Moving country is expensive, it's very stressful. If you move to a non-Anglophone country and English is your first and only language, it can be stressful at the start. And now to those of you, but again, I really recommend it. I had 4.5 years of real security in Munich. As working in this postdoc, I built up all of the teaching and supervisory experience that helped me get the job that I have now. So I recommend it. For those of you with PhDs from non-English speaking countries, so why go abroad, or why go abroad to Ireland or the UK specifically? So one of the pros is that while the positions will probably not be as well paid, and the accommodation will be more expensive and the cost of living is more expensive, any time spent in an Irish or UK university will look really impressive on your CV. I have seen so many chairs and professors in Germany who still include their Erasmus semester from when they were an undergraduate on their CV. If you can afford it, if you can afford the move, if you can get to spend any time there abroad, it will really look good on your CV. These also have exchange agreements. For example, LMU Munich has one with Berkeley in the US, so I know that like a colleague of mine applied and went for a semester, and then he was talking about like his CV then magically had, you know, visiting research scholar at Berkeley. So it's one way to get these little stints abroad that hiring committees will find really impressive. And then the last thing that you can do is apply to be a postdoc on research projects where PI, which means principal investigator or senior academic, will tell you what to research. That's kind of what I did in my first DH postdoc. Pros: it's well paid usually. You gain more experience, you meet other people, you might get to travel and participate in conferences. If it's a big research project, then those conferences and trips will be paid for out of the research allowance. And you would usually but not always get to pick or finesse your topic. You may have to operate within an overarching structure of the project, but you will maybe get to write on something that you want to write on. So these can be really valuable, especially if the contracts are longer. Again, for example, in Cork, a colleague in Old English has just got a big ERC grant, and his replacement is on a 5-year contract. That's a long time for you to settle in, work for a while, and then use that to try and find, a permanent position. Some of the cons, you may be vulnerable to abuse or to exploitative practices. Your PI or boss may overstep. They might take your research or try to appropriate it, or stick themselves on as a co-author when they haven't really co-authored, which is what was happening with me. And to this I would just say that just because someone is good at getting grants doesn't mean that they're a good academic, ethically, or even a good person morally. So much of the European grant projects are built on the backs of precarious labour and exploitation. I've worked in these positions. Most people have or will get a contract, you have a big established researcher, be a mentor and provide a reference, and then you're in a place of vulnerability in terms of whether or not that person is going to abuse that hierarchy. How beneficial this ends up being depends completely on the PI. And I suppose the same can be said for your supervisor at doctoral or postdoctoral level. I hope this doesn't sound like horror story, but I think it's important that you are informed and that you enter into these things with your eyes wide open and be aware, like, just because something is standard or does not mean that it is good. So my advice to you would be, in terms of post-PhD options, before you do anything else, prioritize getting your first book published and published in a good press. I went straight into work and teaching. It was very hard and stressful to have to deal with that, while also having to write a monograph. Once you have your book, then you can target your teaching experience and your funding, or vice versa. Be systematic. Don't try and do everything at the one time. This is not a sprint, it's a bit of a marathon. So look at the things that you haven't done and find ways to do them, slowly, systematically. I hadn't organised a conference. Conferences are hard for me. Of course I hadn't organised one, but I knew I needed to, so I did, and now I have. So tip away at all of these things, bit by bit, round out your CV, make it hard for interview committees to justify not inviting you to interview. Make your profile so strong that if and when you get a no, your response, instead of getting really sad, is to actually say, you know what, your loss. If you don't want me, then I don't want you either. So again, just try and maintain some kind of agency about that. Often we talk about this idea of rejection or failure. I think we should try to reverse that and turn it around. I don't want to work somewhere that doesn't want me or that doesn't value me. So now I'm going to talk, I'm not going to talk about conferences because Ondřej covered all of that, and from what I've seen this morning, you guys are more professional at it than any of us. One thing I will say, however, is I think it's a good practice to write your papers to be read aloud. There's a difference between the language that you use when you need to convey something orally than when you're writing stuff down. So learn how to make your work understandable, and this would be really good for teaching as well. Use accessible language. Avoid the temptation to hide behind or showcase verbiage. Being pretentious with language doesn't mean that you're smart. We're all smart here. Learn to be smarter, make your language accessible and clear. And I'm just going to talk about dealing with negative or hostile questions at the end of your paper. As a rule, most people ask well-intentioned questions. As a rule, these are not the ones that you're going to remember. You're going to remember an asshole that asks you something not nice. And you're going to fret over it, you're going to feel bad. this shouldn't happen. Conferences aren't vivas. This doesn't fall under the remit of constructive criticism. First and foremost, it's the responsibility of the panel chair to shut down and interject if something like this happens. So if you are chairing a panel and a hostile or bad faith question is asked, my advice to you as panel chair or as a future panel chair is to kindly or gently interject. You can invoke timekeeping. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't think we have time for this, let's move on. Maybe we'll talk about it at the coffee break. Redirect it. You do have quite a lot of power as chair. So you can actually say, do you know what, let's skip. So just redirect, or then to make it feel less awkward, you can say, interject and pose a nicer question. If the chair doesn't do this, and you're left to deal with this on your own, which is often the case, my advice to you, and again this is based on my own practice and writing on women authors in the field of Beckett and Joyce studies, and having to face this from my very first conference through to the one that I presented in during the summer, I just agree with them and it shuts them down completely. So take a moment, repeat the question. That's a really interesting question. So what you're asking me is blah, blah, blah. Buy yourself some time, give yourself a chance to settle yourself, and basically, agree with them, shut it down, because a lot of the times when people ask not nice questions, they're not actually there to try and help you. They have some other, personal issue in their life that makes them want to destroy vulnerable postdocs or postgrads. That's not your problem. So yeah, just say, yeah, whatever, yeah, sure, maybe, maybe, I don't know, Beckett wasn't influenced by any women. You're right. Someone asked me recently in a Joyce conference, oh, do you really think Joyce and Stein? And I was like, it's just books, they can't argue at you or crush you if you, just smile at them and skip away. Okay, that's what I would do. I'm not interested in engaging in dialogue with people that aren't nice to me. So I want to talk about networking briefly. In order to segue into that, I want to just talk a little bit about negotiating academia as a queer or neurodiverse person. At us all of the time as a postdoc or PhD student is that networking is so important. You have to network, you have to make connections, blah, blah, blah. This is something that is particularly difficult to do if you're neurodivergent, or even if you're just a little bit shy and bookish and introverted. In other words, an ideal PhD candidate. Other things that might be difficult to negotiate as a postdoc are conference, if you're a little bit shy, neurodivergent, but also if you don't drink alcohol for whatever reason. Conference socials can be difficult, conferences in general. And all I want to say to you guys about this is, as someone that has negotiated academia as a neurodiverse queer person, the only thing that would pragmatically have helped me get a job is legislative and institutional reform to protect vulnerable workers exploited by pan-European university system that is built on and sustained by precarity. Not networking, okay? Not changing my personality. That and also having your book. That said, guys, the only way that you will survive the post-PhD landscape is if you can find a network of other people that sustain you. I've always felt very uncomfortable with the term networking. I don't like it. I don't like what it implies, this kind of quid pro quo exchange system, kind of frantic, almost speed dating practice where people work a room and list off their CVs and all of that. These are not the kind of connections that I am able to do. I'm not good at it. I don't like it. I take a long time to get to know people, and I'm not built to network in the way that is commonly talked about in these career building advice forums. I've seen people size each other up and decide whether they are worth speaking to or whether they are useful to them. I've seen people look at me and look away because I was not considered worth it, because I was not considered important. And I've also noticed how these same people treat me differently now that I have a permanent job and may be considered useful. What they don't know is that I am an elephant and I never forget. So don't be that kind of person, guys. Don't size people up like that. We are all, broadly speaking, practicing under the rubric of humanism. Remember that. Don't let this rat race efface that fact or compromise your integrity as a human being. You do not have to compete to make these connections. You don't have to be extroverted, hyper popular, hyper ambitious, hyper able to drink lots of alcohol after conference events. You don't have to be this kind of apex person to succeed in this profession. My experience is that many of the connections formed in this way ultimately prove to be kind of superficial and without heart, because that's what they are. It's a bit like butter and bread. If you network with everyone, you'll spread things very thin. My experience is that it's possible to move through this world and connect with people in a slower and more holistic manner. Connect with people because they're nice, because you like them, because they like you, because they treat you the way you should be treated, because they share the same values as you, because you want them to succeed and be happy, and they want that for you too. It's so much nicer, first and foremost, to work with people that you care about. So what I would say is, find your people. Don't network, find your people, find friends. Avoid thinking of your friends and fellow ECRs as competition. Solidarity and friendship are what will sustain you. I have applied for jobs and fellowships with friends. I've been shortlisted and interviewed for jobs alongside friends. I've known that the people are just as qualified as I am and are just as deserving. Fight the temptation to turn against each other. Practice solidarity. Blame the system, not each other. All of my networking and collaborative research activities have been done with people that I now consider friends. That's actually not true. Sometimes networking is a good way, or collaborative research is a good way to find out that you don't want to know somebody anymore. But James spoke about reaching out to others when it comes to applying for postdocs. This is something that I did when I was preparing for the Marie Curie. I reached out to a fellow ECR whose work I respected and who had been nice to me a few times at conferences. They read my proposal and they offered advice. They then also applied for a Marie Curie and asked for my feedback. That person, that was 2020, 2021, that person is now one of the people I have collaborated with most intensively. I've organised 2 conferences with him, I'm doing 2 editing projects with him, and they've just become, more than anything else, a close personal friend. They're one of the most important people in my working life, and that just came from reaching out and them being nice to me. So, yeah, I'll move on because we are coming close to the time when we all need to go home and be happy. Publishing and co-editing, I'm going to skip through this if that's okay, and just say why it can be useful in terms of career building. You're going to get a lot of experience of editing and the people you're editing. You meet people, you make contacts. My experience is that the editing work I've done has been the way that people have learned about me and my work more. It's my work on edited volumes that seems to have had the most significant impact on establishing my voice within my specific field. But what I will say to you guys is, be picky. Don't jump into something too soon. Don't overcommit. Focus on your PhD. Focus on your book. That's the most important. There are 2 main options. You can do a journal special issue or an edited volume. They will often take a lot of time. So for example, a special issue that I first proposed in 2018 wasn't published until 2023. Building on what Ondřej said, when I was doing this special issue, which was the first one I did on my own, I did invite established scholars to contribute, thinking of the editorial board and thinking, well, they can't say no to this person, so it's a clever thing to do, to invite or to create a balance between established scholars and emerging scholars. Also remember that people work differently. When I was working with James, it was really fun and rewarding to see our different skill sets. And I think that it's important to allow for that and to accommodate that. learn how to work with people like this in a non-confrontational manner, drawing on each other's skill sets. This is also going to be useful when it comes to working in a research team or in a department or where you have administrative roles. The last thing I'm going to cover before I stop is work-life balance. We work to live, we do not live to work. The road to getting a permanent job is long, it's arduous, it's uncertain. This necessitates that you develop strong personal boundaries, okay? And just remember, if you have a negative experience and there's nothing that you can really do about it, one thing that I like to do is say, okay, the way that this person has made me feel, I'm going to go out of my way to make sure that I never make somebody feel like that again. So it's one way of taking a negative experience, harnessing it and adding it to your power plate or something. Just because established academics practice poor work-life balance doesn't mean that you have to too. They're paid loads more than you are, so they can do whatever they want with their weekends. It's not a flex to work weekends or work in the evenings or talk about how you're emailing when you're on your holidays. It's a sign that you have bad time management. And when you're a professor, you can afford to have bad time management because you're paid a lot more than PhDs or postdocs. But when you are precariously employed, you can't. It can also be hard to say no, but just remember and try to enforce clear boundaries between work and life. Some suggestions, pragmatically, before I finish, guys. Try not to work on your PhD and postdoc at the weekends, or depending on, you know, the jobs that you work outside of university, try to take some time off each week. This might have to change at times. Make sure you use annual leave. Go on a holiday. Make sure that when you are on your leave, you set up an out of office and you don't check your email when you're away. You have to break these rules or do these things. Know and remember that they're wrong, and remind yourself that this is not how it has to be. So when you end up in a permanent position, try not to replicate that oppressive hierarchy. Try to be better than the people who needed to be better to you. The last thing I want to say then is, I suppose if I sounded a little bit angry throughout all of this, it's because I am. And I think I will always be a bit angry about my path to permanency. I hope I will, because it's helping me to speak about this. It's very hard to negotiate the academic system. It's very hard to be precarious, but it's also something you can negotiate on your own terms, I think, I believe, holistically and with integrity. Last thing, guys, if you can, join your union, especially if you're teaching, especially in the UK and Ireland. Thank you very much.